Like I argued in the previous video explaining why socialism fails, I pointed out how socialists view everything from the perspective of theory. Oh, but Karl Marx said this, but Karl Marx said that. Well, I could write a book called The Theories of How Pigs Can Fly. Just because I've written a book called The Theories of How Pigs Can Fly, does it mean to say that it turns out that way in practice? Is it something where I could just simply ignore physics? Could I ignore the laws of gravity? No, of course not. If it doesn't fit their narrative, if the theory in practice turns out a disaster, they just brush it aside and say, well, that wasn't true socialism.
If there's one thing America has down to a science, it's twisting the meaning of words and using them to terrify the population. Ever since the Soviet Union rose to prominence to the point of competing with the US for global supremacy, the powers that be have fought hard to burn the image of communism and socialism as great evils into the mind of the average American. In this episode, we're going to correct the record. There's nothing wrong with criticizing ideas you disagree with. But in order to do that, you have to engage with accurate depictions of those ideas.
If you listen carefully to his language, he's speaking about an idea. That's all socialism is, that when put into practice, it's faced with dire consequences. The dire consequence of getting rid of the private sector and you're only left with the printing press. What I didn't touch upon, and I should have, if you look around you, even among socialists, they're demanding for higher paid wages.
I live paycheck to paycheck. It's incredibly hard. I mean, I have bills to pay.
That is telling you that people want to work for a living in terms of they want to work for a wage. They don't want to work for nothing. Now he's saying that, oh well, you have to understand the idea first. Well, we do understand the idea. Is this idea of a moneyless, a classless, and a stateless system. Just because you intend for something to be a certain given way doesn't mean to say it turns out that way in practice. Even if he was to go down the road of a moneyless based system, you've not got the information of prices, so there's no price information signals. So how then do you know what to produce more of and stop producing? You don't have the information of prices to tell you that information. And then on top of that, you are faced with the reality that people don't want to work for 0% wage. Clearly he doesn't understand the ideology of communism, what communal ownership is. The very reason for why communal ownership was a disastrous failure was because they could not work for the fruits of their own labour. There was no individual liberty to do so. What he's trying to critique, he doesn't understand himself. Communal ownership has nothing to do with, personal ownership. Personal is a contradiction of communal. Personal means it's individual. Communal ownership is collective ownership. Collective ownership is collective ownership. So when you're talking about personal ownership of possessions, where individuals can own their own possessions, that's relation to that of individual ownership. So if you take away the individual's right to owning their own property, then of course you're faced with a dire consequence where people lose the incentive to work hard. That's exactly why people were dying of starvation. Doing the same thing over and expecting different results is the definition of insanity. Yet despite the fact of mountains of historical evidence to back up its failure, he somehow thinks his theoretical nonsense is greater than that of what you put into practice.
So, let's talk about America's favorite boogeyman, Marxism. But before we do that, we need to briefly discuss the history of capitalism. Once upon a time, there existed an economic system that was neither capitalism nor communism. Shocking, right? Under this arrangement, lords granted parcels of land to the lower echelons of society, and the recipients, known as vassals, in exchange would work the land and vow to fight for their lord should he call upon them. This was a pretty sweet deal for the nobility, because they got laborers to work their land, grow them food, and fight in their wars. The vassals had little choice other than to enter into these agreements in order to stave off starvation and abject poverty. This type of arrangement later became known as feudalism, and from a modern perspective, it seems outdated and cruel. Fast forward several centuries, and we begin to see a fledgling new economic system take its first steps. Somewhere between the 14th and 15th centuries, feudalism lost ground to a market-based system, one that elevated some of the lower tiers of society, creating a new merchant class. Not quite peasant, but certainly not nobility. Since that time, various interpretations of market-based economies have been implemented with varying degrees of success around the world. When proponents of capitalism say that it raised the standard of living for millions of people, they're correct. Capitalism has its place in history, and has unquestionably increased global production many times over since the days of feudalism. But just like technology keeps advancing, so too does history need to keep moving. And just like feudalism was overtaken when it became outdated, so too will capitalism need to be replaced with a superior system.
That is quite a heavy concession to make on his behalf. However, he tries to downplay things a little. The main thing is, we've got a concession from him to say that, of course, capitalism had lifted the living standards and wealth. He doesn't touch upon the fact that capitalism did that for the masses. Throughout American history, for example, it's been rife with mercantilism, in other words, anti-capitalism. He doesn't tell you that, however. He wants you to believe that somehow this system today that you live under is somehow capitalism. That's what he wants you to believe, as if to try and justify an argument, to move past capitalism. Well, I'm afraid to say we've already moved past capitalism, and that faced its own consequences. The problem in his argument, feudalism was inherently collectivist, and there was a strong difference between individualism and collectivism. The world had faced collectivism for centuries, for millennia in fact. He doesn't tell you that feudalism was based on political centralisation, something that strongly defines socialism. Socialism is based on the collective ownership of the means of production, or collective control of the means of production. Feudalism, you had an aristocracy who would rule over everybody else, and the aristocracy would act as the central planner of the economy. If he understands the definition of socialism, he would know that central planning is a very big part of what defines socialism. What you had was the collective ownership of the means of production. You had what you called communal ownership. Now, before the Industrial Revolution, all you need to understand is that across the entire planet Earth, there were periodical famines. What was it that solved that problem? It was basically the privatisation of farmland to do with the enclosure movement, which is why if you fly over any country today, it's like a patchwork quilt. Now, what caused the periodical famines was the communal ownership of property. If you've ever heard of something called the classroom experiment, it's faced with what we call the free rider problem. The free rider problem simply means that people are free riding off the backs of others, and everything that's to be produced is to be put into a communal pool, because that's what communal ownership is about. It's not about personal ownership of possessions. Personal is individual. If you support personal ownership, you support individual ownership. That's what personal means. Personal is individual. Individual ownership is not collective ownership. When one person dropped their work rate by 50%, that person would still get more or less the same as the rest of them. When the rest of them discovered that this person was getting pretty much the same despite the fact he's working with 50% less work rate, their work rate begins to drop. Their incentive to work hard has been destroyed. An historian Bethel even pointed out that during the starving time, even the hardest working of people lost the will to live. It was disastrous simply because the individuals could not work for the fruits of their own labour. The funny thing was, and you would see history repeat itself with that of the likes of the Soviet Union, of course China, millions lost their life due to starvation. History repeating itself. These people never pay attention.
We have a tendency to believe that history is only something that happened in the past, that we've now reached the end of history. This perspective makes it difficult to see that life and progress are ongoing processes, and that there will come a time when capitalism will seem just as outdated as feudalism.
You know, the laughable thing is, folk, we've not really lived under capitalism. We never really had the opportunity to. Through all the socialist government interventionism, it is why you live under a mixed economy. You've been living under a mixed economy for more than a century and a half. You've been living in the absence of a capitalist system, which is a free market. Where's your free market money? Where is this free market economy? He wants you to believe that somehow this is capitalism. He doesn't even bother to touch upon what capitalism actually is. And the thing is, we've got recorded history. Unlike himself, we can point to recorded history and show that the economy has proved better off when it's been left be to regulate itself. That's why when you look at Singapore, When you look at Hong Kong, their most successful economic periods in history, when they were strongly free. Likewise, the same goes for Sweden. But he doesn't even bother to touch upon the fact that all that government interventionism was socialism, and it was that socialist government interventionism that created the economic problems that you're faced with today. Take, for example, cause of the boom and bust cycle of the 20th century through fixing of the interest rates. What's that got to do with capitalism? Nothing, because capitalism is about leaving interest rates be to the free market. They create a problem through their socialist government interventionism, and then they project the blame off elsewhere and say, oh, it was all the fault of capitalism, and then speak about the end of capitalism. They can't even point to you an example where socialism has ever worked. Not one example. And simply because it didn't live up to his narrative, it didn't live up to his theory of Marxism. Oh, that wasn't socialism. It's laughable.
I believe we're at a point where large portions of the world population are beginning to realize that global capitalism is actively making their lives worse. The system having generated such vast oceans of capital in the hands of the powerful that it's left the majority to suffer needlessly, even in tremendously wealthy countries.
I only need to touch upon this very briefly. I know that corporatism is a serious problem in the economy. Giant corporations created monopolies, oligopolies, it's created the cartels, it's allowed the cartels to thrive. Take, for example, the private pharmaceutical companies that got away with shafting the consumer, etc. It's anti-consumerist. That's why I oppose the corporatist system, but it's a myth to say that the rich have been getting richer and the poor have been getting poorer. If anything, you could take, for example, the period under Ronald Reagan. You saw the rich get richer and the poor get richer faster.
This inflection point, the shift in public perception to viewing capitalism less than favorably, signals the beginning of a massive societal change. Capitalism is falling out of favor, just as feudalism did those hundreds of years ago.
I can tell you this, that you're going to be faced with serious consequences if people are falling away from capitalism. If they think that they live under capitalism today, they're grossly mistaken. And if they think capitalism is the cause of their problems, again, they are grossly mistaken. And if they think socialism is going to solve their problems, by Christ, it's more than just grossly mistaken. It's a serious mistake. It's a mistake that will cost the lives of countless millions of people. Now, it's amazing how often socialism has been a disastrous failure, that it takes extreme levels of ignorance to even stare past it. And so if people are falling away from that, then you've got a serious problem, a very serious problem. It really is dangerous. It's got no way of avoiding totalitarianism. It's all well speaking about the theory of Marxism, but at the end of the day, ask yourself this question. You're going to need to get rid of the private sector completely if you want Marxism. How are you going to reach there without a dictator? How are you going to get rid of the private sector completely without a dictator? It's not going to be a Jeremy Corbyn. They don't have the guts to do so. They would back down eventually. So you need a specific type of character to completely rid of the private sector. The private sector is not rid of through negotiating. I mean, what happens then if private land and business owners say, no, we're not giving up our private land or business? What are you going to do then? Well, you need a specific type of character to get rid of it. You need a dictator. And then you ask the question, okay then, well, once you've got rid of it, how's the state just going to wither away? And even if the state just withers away, who's going to stop people like me going and doing my own thing? I mean, if there's no government, how are you going to stop individuals doing their own thing? Well, that's the issue. You need totalitarianism. You need dictatorship. Because part and parcel of human nature, we are self-interested. And socialists, even although they could deny this to you, socialists admit this by then trying to say that human beings are greedy. So there you have it. Human nature and economics completely contradicts them. It's all theoretical nonsense. They can't even give you any real-world examples.